Is this some kind of joke? The question, sharp and laced with disdain, cut through the sterile, climate-controlled air of the corridor. Petty Officer Second Class Davies stood with his feet planted shoulder-width apart, a posture he'd practiced in front of a mirror until it felt natural. His uniform was immaculate, the creases in his trousers like surgical incisions. He looked at the old man in the plain red collared shirt and faded jeans, a small, stubborn island of civilian casualness in a sea of military precision. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time. What is your business at the JITF Command Center?" Carl Whitman, 81 years old, didn't flinch. He remained perfectly still, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. His eyes, a pale but clear blue, weren't focused on the young security officer but on a large, wall-mounted screen at the far end of the hall. It displayed a complex weather map of the Caribbean, swirling green and yellow patterns over the deep blue of the ocean. He'd seen maps like that before, though the technology was a world away from the grease-penciled charts he remembered. The same water, though, the same unforgiving currents. "I'm here to see an old friend," Carl said, his voice a low, gravelly hum weathered by time and salt. Davies exchanged an exasperated look with his partner, a young seaman who looked barely old enough to shave. The seaman shifted his weight, his own discomfort a stark contrast to the old man's placid demeanor. "An old friend," Davies repeated, the words dripping with sarcasm. "Right, and this friend works here, at one of the most secure military intelligence facilities on the planet?" "He does," Carl confirmed, his gaze finally shifting to meet Davies's. There was no anger in his eyes, no fear, just a quiet, unshakable patience. James Reynolds, Vice Admiral Reynolds. The name hung in the air for a moment. Davies's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty, but it was quickly snuffed out by professional cynicism. He'd seen this tactic before, old-timers, confused or conniving, dropping a big name to try and bypass security. It was Chapter 4 in the base security manual. "Vice Admiral Reynolds," Davies scoffed, his confidence returning. "Of course. And I suppose the president is your golfing buddy. Sir, I need to see your authorization. A common access card. Visitor's pass. Something." "I don't have one," Carl said simply. "I was told to just give my name at the gate. Seems they forgot to pass the message along down here." "They didn't forget," Davies snapped, his patience finally evaporating, "because there was no message. People don't just drop by to see the commander of JITF South. This isn't a social club." By now, the quiet confrontation had begun to draw attention. Uniformed personnel, moving with purpose along the corridor, slowed their pace. A few stopped, pretending to check their phones or converse with colleagues, their eyes darting towards the scene. The low hum of the facility's electronics seemed to amplify the tension. A small, silent audience was gathering. Carl felt their eyes on him, but his posture didn't change. Public scrutiny was nothing new. He'd faced far worse than the curious glances of office-bound sailors. Davies was keenly aware of the audience, and it fueled his aggression. He saw a test. He saw a chance to demonstrate his rigid adherence to protocol. He saw a confused old man in a red shirt making a mockery of the security he was sworn to uphold. "Let me see some identification," Davies demanded, his voice louder now. "Driver's license. Anything." Carl slowly reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He carefully extracted his Florida driver's license and handed it over. Davies snatched it from his hand. He stared at the name Carl Whitman and the date of birth. His eyes narrowed. "Born in 1942, he said with a derisive chuckle. "You've been around a while, Mr. Whitman. Long enough to know you can't just walk into a place like this." He handed the license back dismissively. "Look, I'm trying to be nice here. You seem confused. Why don't you let us escort you off the base, and you can go home and have a nice nap?" The condescension was thick enough to taste. Carl slid his license back into his wallet without a word. His silence was more infuriating to Davies than any argument could have been. It was the silence of someone who didn't feel the need to defend himself, and to the young officer that was the ultimate sign of disrespect. "That's it," Davies said, stepping closer, invading Carl's personal space. The seaman behind him took a half-step forward as well, his hand hovering near his sidearm. "I'm done playing games. You are in a restricted area without authorization, and you're refusing to cooperate. You're claiming an association with a flag officer that is clearly false. Under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, that can be construed as impersonating a service member or attempting to gain access under false pretenses. This is a federal offense." Carl's expression remained neutral, but a deep weariness settled into his features. He'd hoped it wouldn't come to this. He'd hoped for a quiet visit, a cup of coffee with an old shipmate, a chance to see how the world he'd helped build was faring. "I'm not impersonating anyone, son," he said, his voice still even. "I am who I say I am. And you're a Navy SEAL too, I suppose?" Davies sneered, throwing out the most common and cliché lie he heard from valor thieves. Carl didn't answer. He just held the young man's gaze. The lack of denial was all the confirmation Davies needed. Unbelievable. The nerve. "All right, you're coming with us. We'll get this sorted out downtown." He reached for Carl's arm. "Hands behind your back. Now." As Davies grabbed Carl's left arm to twist it behind him, the sleeve of the red-collared shirt slid up past his wrist, exposing the weathered skin of his forearm. And there, just below the elbow, was a tattoo. It was old. The black ink faded to a murky blue-green, the lines blurred by decades of sun and sea. It wasn't the clean, modern SEAL trident that Davies was used to seeing on bumper stickers. It was something older, cruder, a cartoonish frog skeleton holding a stick of dynamite, with the letters UDT-21 etched beneath it. The image was meaningless to Davies, just another piece of sad, fake bravado. But as his fingers tightened on Carl's arm, the world seemed to momentarily warp for the old man. It wasn't the sterile hum of the air conditioner he heard, but the chugging roar of a PBR's twin diesel engines. The scent of linoleum was replaced by the cloying metallic smell of river water, mud and cordite in the humid air of the Mekong Delta. He felt not the young officer's grip, but the cold, slimy texture of a mangrove root under his hand as he pulled himself from the murky water in the dead of night. The fluorescent lights overhead became a starless, oppressive sky. For a split second he was 22 again, his arm adorned with that same fresh, dark tattoo, gripping the stock of a Stoner 63 rifle, his heart pounding a silent rhythm against the cacophony of the jungle. Then, just as quickly, the vision was gone. He was back in the hallway, an old man being put in handcuffs. At a nearby workstation, Ensign Miller, a junior intelligence analyst with a knack for pattern recognition, had been watching the entire exchange with growing unease. He was a history buff, a Naval Academy graduate who had spent more time reading about the UDTs and the birth of the SEALs than he had studying advanced calculus. He didn't recognize the old man, but he recognized the aura. It was the same quiet intensity he'd seen in archival photos of the legends. Men like Dick Marcinko and Rudy Boish. When Davies started putting the man in cuffs, Miller knew he had to act. Protocol dictated he stay out of it to let security handle their business. But his gut, the same instinct that made him a good analyst, was screaming that this was a monumental mistake. He'd seen the sleeve right up. He didn't recognize the specific tattoo, but he recognized its age, its style. It was from another era. He picked up the secure line on his desk, his heart thumping against his ribs. Direct intervention was a career ender, but a quiet, deniable phone call, that was just information sharing. He dialed the 4-digit extension for the Admiral's personal staff. The phone was answered on the first ring. Flag Aide's office, Lieutenant Commander Phillips speaking. "Commander," Miller said, keeping his voice low and steady, turning his back to the scene in the hall. "This is Ensign Miller from J2. Sir, I apologize for the direct call, but there's a situation developing at the main entrance checkpoint." "What kind of situation, Ensign?" Phillips's voice was sharp, impatient. The Admiral was in a critical video teleconference. "Security is detaining an elderly civilian, sir. He's claiming to know the Admiral personally. They're processing him for removal and potential charges of impersonation." Phillips sighed. "Security can handle it, Miller. We get cranks all the time." "Sir, I don't think he's a crank," Miller pressed, taking a risk. "He's calm, very calm. They're cuffing him now." He gave them his name, Carl Whitman. There was a profound silence on the other end of the line. For a full 5 seconds, the only sound was the faint electronic hiss of the secure connection. Miller held his breath. Finally, Phillips's voice returned, stripped of all its earlier impatience, replaced by a cold, controlled urgency. "Whitman. Carl Whitman. Carl Whitman. Did you say Carl Whitman?" "Yes, sir," Miller confirmed. "Describe him, now." "Elderly, sir. Maybe 80. White hair, blue eyes, wearing a red polo shirt." Another pause. This one even more charged than the first. Miller could hear the muffled sound of a chair scraping back and a door opening. "Ensign," Phillips said, his voice now dangerously quiet, "keep your eyes on them. Do not let them move him from that spot. If they try to take him to a vehicle, you will step in, state my authority, and tell them to stand fast. The Admiral is on his way down. Do you understand me, Ensign?" "Yes, Commander," Miller breathed, a wave of relief washing over him. "I mean it," Phillips added. "The Admiral is on his way. God help those security kids if they've bruised him." The line went dead. Miller turned back towards the scene. The cavalry was coming. Inside the Admiral's spacious, soundproofed office, the atmosphere was tense. Vice Admiral James Reynolds, a tall, lean man with a face that looked carved from granite, was in the middle of a classified briefing with a dozen senior officers and civilian agency heads. He was pointing to a satellite image projected on a massive screen when his flag aide, Lieutenant Commander Phillips, burst through the door without knocking, a shocking breach of protocol. "Admiral," Phillips said, his face pale. He leaned in and whispered urgently in the Admiral's ear. The room watched as a remarkable transformation occurred. The stern, focused commander vanished. Vice Admiral Reynolds froze, his hands still pointing at the screen. His eyes, which had been scanning intelligence data, went wide with disbelief. The color drained from his face. He slowly lowered his arm and turned to his aide, a single word escaping his lips as a hushed question. "Carl?" Phillips nodded grimly. "Security has him in cuffs at the main entrance. They thought he was an imposter." A storm gathered in the Admiral's eyes. It was a look the other officers in the room had only ever seen directed at the nation's most dangerous enemies. He straightened to his full height, his bearing shifting from that of a strategist to that of a warrior. The collected authority in the room seemed to bend towards him. "Get my cover," he commanded, his voice a low growl that resonated with absolute authority. He didn't wait for a reply. He strode towards the door, his long legs covering the distance in 3 quick strides. He pushed past his stunned aide and out into the hallway, leaving a room full of bewildered high-ranking officials staring at an empty chair. The briefing was, for all intents and purposes, over. Justice was about to be served, and it was coming in the form of a 2-star admiral in his pristine service dress whites. Back in the corridor, Davies was feeling triumphant. He had the old man cuffed and standing against the wall. The small crowd of onlookers had legitimized his actions in his own mind. He was the guardian at the gate, the thin line protecting the nation's secrets from cranks and liars. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is S2. I have a 10:15 at the JSOC entrance. Male, elderly. Transport required to base security for processing. Potential stolen valor." As he spoke, he looked at Carl, who was staring at the floor, his shoulders slightly slumped. To Davies, it was the posture of defeat. "You know, guys like you make me sick," Davies said, his voice low and filled with self-righteous venom. "My grandfather served. He earned his uniform. He didn't have to lie about it. Men died for the honor you're trying to steal just to impress someone." He leaned in closer. "We're going to run your prints, and I promise you when they come back you're going to face the consequences for this little stunt. Maybe a psychiatric evaluation is in order. See if you've got all your marbles." Carl finally lifted his head. He looked at the angry, certain young man in front of him, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion showed in his eyes. It wasn't anger, it was pity. It started not with a siren, but with a sound, the rhythmic percussive slap of hard-soled dress shoes on polished linoleum, moving at a speed just short of a run. It was a sound of singular purpose, and it cut through the ambient noise of the building. The onlookers in the hallway turned as one. Their casual, curious expressions melted away, replaced by ramrod straight posture and looks of alarm. They parted like a wave, clearing a path down the center of the corridor. First came the Admiral's Marine Master Gunnery Sergeant, a man whose chest was so laden with ribbons it looked like a military history exhibit. Behind him, moving with a predatory grace, was Vice Admiral James Reynolds. His white uniform was a beacon in the fluorescent light, the gold on his shoulder boards and the sleeve of his jacket gleaming. His face was a thundercloud. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the seamen. His eyes, like laser sights, were locked on one person, Carl Whitman. Davies saw the Admiral approaching and his mind short-circuited. He snapped to attention, his hand flying up in a salute, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Admiral on deck," he barked, his voice cracking. Admiral Reynolds didn't return the salute. He didn't even slow down. He walked right past Davies as if he were a piece of furniture and stopped directly in front of Carl. He looked at his old friend, at the deep lines etched around his eyes, and then his gaze fell to the steel cuffs binding the gnarled, age-spotted wrists. The Admiral's face, already hard, seemed to petrify. He turned his head slowly, deliberately, and fixed his gaze on Davies. The full weight of his command, the power of 2 stars on his shoulder, descended upon the young petty officer. "Petty officer," Reynolds said, his voice dangerously soft, a quiet rumble that promised a hurricane. "What is the meaning of this?" Davies's throat went dry. He swallowed hard, his salute wavering. "Sir, this civilian was in a restricted area without authorization. He claimed to know you, sir. I suspected stolen valor. I was following protocol, sir." You were following protocol, Reynolds repeated, the words not a question but a condemnation. He looked back at Carl, then at his Marine. Master Guns, remove these restraints. Now, the Master Gunnery Sergeant stepped forward with a key, and the cuffs clicked open. Carl slowly rubbed his wrists, his eyes never leaving the Admiral's face. Reynolds placed a gentle hand on Carl's shoulder, a gesture of profound respect and apology. Then, in the dead silence of the hallway, in front of a dozen witnesses, Vice Admiral James Reynolds snapped to the most rigid, perfect position of attention of his entire career. He raised his hand in a salute so crisp it seemed to slice the air. He held it, his eyes locked on Carl's. "Master Chief Whitman," the Admiral's voice boomed, echoing in the corridor. "It is an honor to have you here, sir." The title, Master Chief, hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Davies's jaw fell open. The seaman beside him looked like he might faint. A Master Chief was the highest enlisted rank, a figure of legend and respect. But for a two-star admiral to call one sir and salute him first, it was unheard of. It inverted the very firmament of military structure. Reynolds held the salute, his eyes still fixed on Carl. He then turned his head slightly, addressing the stunned onlookers without lowering his hand. "For those of you who don't know," the Admiral announced, his voice ringing with a fierce protective pride, "you are looking at one of the founding members of SEAL Team 2, Master Chief Carl Whitman. His file is mostly classified, but what I can tell you is that he holds the Navy Cross, 3 silver stars and 5 bronze stars, all with the V for valor. He was swimming in the black water of the Mekong Delta when my biggest concern was passing algebra. This man is not a guest, he is not a civilian. He is a living legend of the United States Navy, and he is my hero." He finally lowered his salute and turned his full, unmitigated fury upon Davies. "Your name, Petty Officer?" "Davies, sir. Petty Officer 2nd Class, he stammered, his face the color of ash. "Petty Officer Davies," Reynolds said, his voice dropping to an icy whisper. "You will be in my office at 0800 tomorrow with your divisional chief and officer. You will explain to me, in detail, how you came to the conclusion that a man with more combat experience than everyone in this hallway combined was a liar. You mistook quiet dignity for weakness. You saw one of the finest warriors this Navy has ever produced, and you decided he was a thief. You are a disgrace to that uniform. Get out of my sight." Dismissed. Davies, utterly broken, could only manage a choked "Aye, aye, sir," before turning and practically fleeing down the hallway. As the Admiral watched him go, a quiet hand settled on his forearm. It was Carl. "Easy, Jimmy," the old Master Chief said softly. "The boy was just doing his job. A little overzealous, maybe, but the protocols are there for a reason." Reynolds looked at Carl, his anger deflating, replaced by a deep sense of shame. "He put you in handcuffs, Carl. He humiliated you." "Wasn't the first time," Carl said with a wry, tired smile. "And it probably won't be the last. The uniform changes, the faces get younger, but the mission stays the same. Protect the house." He was protecting the house. You can't fault a man for that. As he spoke, another memory, sharp and clear, surfaced. It wasn't a traumatic flash this time, but a warm one. A stuffy makeshift hooch near the Cambodian border, lit by a single bare bulb. A fellow frogman, a brother, was hunched over his arm with a jury-rigged tattoo gun made from a small motor and a sharpened needle. The buzz of the needle, the sting on his skin, the laughter and camaraderie of men who lived on the knife's edge. The tattoo wasn't a badge of honor to show off to the world. It was a private mark of a sacred tribe, a symbol of a promise made in blood and salt water to the men beside him, a promise to always have their back. The fallout from the incident was swift and decisive. Vice Admiral Reynolds, true to his word, used the encounter as a teachable moment, a phrase that made every security officer on base shudder. A new training module was developed and mandated for all security personnel. It focused on veteran interaction, de-escalation techniques, and most pointedly, the history of naval special warfare insignia and heritage. The case of the unassuming Master Chief became a cautionary tale whispered in training rooms. A formal letter of apology signed by the Admiral himself was delivered to Carl Whitman's quiet home. He read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in a shoebox filled with other papers and memories. About a week later, Carl was sitting at a small table outside a local coffee shop, enjoying the warm Florida sun. He watched the cars go by, lost in thought, when a shadow fell over his table. He looked up to see a young man in civilian clothes, a nervous-looking polo shirt and jeans, standing there, shifting his weight from foot to foot. It took Carl a moment to place him without the crisp uniform and the aggressive posture. It was Davies. The young man's face was stripped of all its former arrogance. He looked humbled, ashamed, and profoundly tired. "Master Chief Whitman," he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Carl nodded slowly. Son. Davies swallowed hard, his hands twisting together. Sir, I just wanted to find you, to apologize. Properly. What I did, how I treated you, there's no excuse. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Deeply sorry. Carl looked at the young man for a long moment, his blue eyes searching his face. He saw not a villain but a kid who had made a serious mistake, a kid who had learned a hard lesson in a very public way. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. Sit down, son. Let me buy you a coffee. Davies hesitated, then slowly sat down, looking as if he expected to be dismissed at any moment. Carl went and got them both a black coffee and set one down in front of Davies. They sat in silence for a minute, the only sound the clinking of spoons in the distant traffic. The most important thing to learn out there, Carl said finally, his gaze distant, isn't how to spot an enemy. You get pretty good at that fast. The hard part, the thing that takes a lifetime, is learning how to see the person right in front of you. Their history, their hurt, their